Thanks for being here, and welcome. Now, even though I don't think we're flying through space, I do believe in solar flares, or luminary flares, and I've become very hypersensitive to them. And my animals, I notice a difference with them, and there's a difference between the feeling of the initial burst, which can sometimes cause a headache, and of course, in the following days, the high winds that follow. And so I've been tracking this in both personal experience and online for well over 15 years. And I think this is a big part of resets, understanding this phenomenon. Although it's just one part, that's things above. And then things below. We can see examples, and I've made videos in the past about receding oceans. And not just like a tide, but receding for days. And in other places, flooding. The ocean's rising, and again, not tides. We saw this many times in Venice, and I think there's a pumping mechanism. There would have to be a drain and a pump, and I think the fountain is up in the north, Mount Meru. We're told Mount Meru has 4 major rivers, and 2 of them flow in and 2 flow out, pumping, circulating, and regulating the waters in the realm. And when we look at star forts, we see plug holes. All star forts have plug holes. Even the forts that are non-star shaped have capped plug holes. If we were to look out my backyard, we would see 2 plug holes. In this case, they are access to my septic system or waste disposal system. I also have a plug hole out by the road, which is the water main access, and essentially a type of utility. I recently had a question about that, so I thought I would just answer it. And the star forts are some of the oldest, in my opinion. They are the foundation of the realm, and they've been built upon cathedrals, and yet all these different stages are different resets. All of them seem to come before our people, who, as we've discussed a million times in past videos, are not capable of building anything that we see, all the different stages. And I would say the brick cities are some of the most recent. And even the crystal palaces, or just giant glass greenhouses, are also some of the most recent, but still before our time. And I think these giant glass palaces, essentially, that were used for the world's fairs were also utilities. And as beautiful as they were, I think that they were the waste disposal hubs, and also growing. One of my favorite homes in modern times is the Earth Ship. And the Earth Ship is a perfect home, partially buried in the earth. It has a series of small ponds in which the water runs into your wastewater and is recycled, comes out perfectly clean, has a series of different ponds with fish and plant life. And this old world was the masters of a perfect and harmonious way of living, it seems. And when we look at the island of Malta here, essentially when we zoom out, it just looks like an island. We can zoom out even further, and we see the Mediterranean, and just how small this island is in comparison to everything surrounding it. But when we look carefully, we see that it's not actually natural land. And we're just going to use this little corner here. I mean, we could pick any part. Which part? Here, star fort, here, star fort, here, star fort. Star forts everywhere. Over here. And some of them really looking like some kind of fortress, but in some cases, the entire land is built from the ground up. And this is not brick, which is why I say this is earlier than the brick building civilization. And this is an island, very low lying land, and you can see that it is built from the ground up. no end in sight. The walls continue. They've just not been excavated here, but you can see the impression. And this is biblical. Going down underground and shaped into an intelligent design, not just a fluke. Every single part. Are you seeing all these walls? Wall, wall, wall. Look at this. And again, I'm trying to differentiate or explain the different stages. And again, another people would come and build brick on top of these. And cheap housing like we see here, and chapels and cathedrals and everything else. And one might say, oh no, you're just reaching here. But when the entire coastline and every part of the realm is also littered with star forts, in our face, never having been taught anything about the star fort in American history, we have to put two and two together. And this is the beginning. There is nothing else as far as the foundation. Again, it goes underground, but this is the beginning, these blocks. And for some reason, perhaps because of politics, this city has been well preserved. And we can see all the different stages. I mean, of course, a cathedral like this is before our time. Same with this one. But is much newer than all of this. That was clearly built by a superior people. A giant people. I mean, look at the cars here. There's no need for this. And it just wouldn't happen. Nobody is building an island. And the island is not an island. The island is a building. And in fact, it would be safe to say that all land masses are old buildings. And here, people would tell us that this is natural stone down here. But when we see it fusing right into the structure, it's clear that it is the structure. There's nothing natural about this. And here, in fact, we can see a plug hole, if you were wondering. And just absolutely massive. I mean, you can see a car here. This is twice the size of a car. So giant utilities for a giant people. And here we can see a brick building, a newer time, and still in ruins. So now let's look at something else. I wanted to jump over to Kingman, Arizona, and we've looked at what they call cart ruts or wagon ruts. I even did a boots on the ground way back at this location, and we can see that trail right here if we zoom in. And why was North America hit so much harder than the Mediterranean? Why is everything unrecognizable? And I think it comes down to the sun again. Where is its position when it resets? It's kind of like musical chairs, around and around until the reset. And who doesn't get a chair? And I think North America may have very recently lost its chair. Here was a ruined castle in the Napa Valley of California, made of these Richardsonian blocks and mostly buried, actually. Can you imagine the size of this building in California with giant pine trees growing in the center of the building? Here was some old electro machinery. I forget where I got this now, but it really reminded me of the top of the Simon Bamberger monument out in the middle of Utah without a trail or proper parking lot. And of course, like the lingams found in India, some of them still generating heat, as the channel Praveen Mohan has shown. And here I couldn't get enough of watching planes take off and the way they just seem to float up at what seems like 35 miles an hour. Just ridiculous. And this is a big deal. This is in our face. And these babies are not functioning the way we're told. And here, just a little look at Kingman again, Kingman, Arizona. A screenshot that I took. You have 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5 roads, some of them just abandoned, some being used as rail, and it's all advanced infrastructure from a past time. And these were some bricks shared by a Russian channel that I'm sub to. I don't understand what he's saying, but he presents really cool things. and somehow I think that I get the gist of it. And on this particular day, he was talking about feet and probably about these bricks. See how a lot of the noses have been busted off? We've discussed this before. And I think the noses that have been busted would have had very identifiable traits to a past people that I think they don't want us to know were either here or built this or something. But anyway, they busted a lot of these noses all over the realm, the ones that they didn't want us to see. But then there was the feet, and nobody considered busting the feet up. Nobody thought anyone would be smart enough to identify the feet and the people that they may have belonged to. And here he gives us a depiction, and I determined that I have a Roman foot. And it was really interesting because now we can look at this foot and make some kind of sense out of this foot. I mean, just glorious. Not just the size, but the shape. And again, I don't understand what he's saying in his videos, but I get it. This is none of those other feet. This glorious foot. Most people have almost dead-looking feet, especially with shoving them in shoes like we do. But this is a functional foot, not like any of these. And just like the old star forts built from the ground up being 1,000 times more glorious than anything we create today, I think we see the same thing with this foot. Our feet have only gone backwards, along with everything. So next, for part 2, I'm just gonna let loose and rant a little. I can remember being angry at 4 years old. We lived in an apartment complex, all brick, old, almost like a super communist complex block consisting of maybe 10 brick buildings, and I would wander all over the place. Around this time period I became very ill and started maybe a 10 or 12-year relationship with the corrupt medical community. Looking back on it, I'm grateful because it opened up my eyes. It's hard to understand the dynamics of your own family when you're that young. You're kind of optimistic. You look around and say, well, at least it's not like this or that. But it was easy with the medical community. They were not my family, and I cut them no slack, at least in my thoughts and observation. It didn't take more than 3 or 4 years of being assaulted by the medical system that I realized they did no good. I was diagnosed early on with asthma and fed steroid inhalers. But when I realized there was no cure, I became disinterested in continuing to take these inhalers and take shots in my arms and breathing treatments once a week. All worthless, just drugging me and in fact making me worse. Once I went camping with a friend and his family. We went on a hike and I didn't have my inhaler. Felt I needed it. But I pushed on and taught myself breathing before I ever got into Buddhism and realized I could control this and I could get better. To this day, I don't have a doctor. If I found myself dying, I would go to the emergency room. But otherwise, I've educated myself on medicine. I'm well versed in Chinese medicine and herbs and energy work, qigong, different breathing techniques, even the Yi Jin Ching, the secret to eternal life. But I don't practice that anymore. I'm not interested in eternal life. I'm more interested in truth. Truth in everything. When we're young, we wish for superficial things. But as time passes, I think we refine our wishes. Up till very recently, all I wanted was to know the truth. But this evening, I think all I want is to be and perhaps to live my truth. Knowledge is very important, but at a certain point I think it's stupid. If you're not putting it into practice, doing something, most certainly in your own life. But what about as a people? I feel like I make these videos for and with. If you're listening to this, I consider you my people. I can't help but think and notice that things are ramping up. The more we reveal, the more they're trashing the system, cashing in, and perhaps preparing to recycle this place and the system. Of course, they're recycling the minds of the youth constantly in public schools, and I'm grateful For my experience in public school, it seemed like I encountered some really free-thinking teachers, maybe only half a dozen, towards the end in high school. And what they taught really had nothing to do with the subject of their class, but it was the most valuable. And I'm not sure which political leanings they partook in, and I don't care. I don't care about either party. Both garbage, in my opinion. But these teachers taught me to think critically, and I didn't realize it at the time. I did and I didn't. One of them was more subtle, Mrs. Miller, and she would teach us to critique things. In fact, it would be our homework assignment. And I loved it. I loved the critique, possibly because I felt I had been silenced in life by the school system, by my parents, by my friends' parents. I noticed that everyone was trying to shut me up and stop thinking and to stop being creative. And I'm glad I had a rebellious spirit and did not obey. I wanted the freedom to think. I wanted the freedom to mess up and do things differently. At 14, I snapped and ran away from home. For 2 weeks, I stayed at my friend's house. My friend lived with his mother and 2 younger brothers, twins. I had a great time. I got my first dog in a pool hall in Old Scottsdale. It was called Video Roundup. I don't know if it's still there, but it was the place to hang out. It was like a party. I felt so grateful that my friend's mother would allow me to stay, not question or judge me, even bring a dog in. He was like a little golden retriever mutt kind of mix, smaller than a regular golden. I enjoyed feeding him and caring for him. I might have stayed forever. I had no desire to go back, and I knew my parents loved me, but I also knew that they were pushing a system which they didn't create on me, and I didn't want it. The following year, I got a job, and even though I was only 15, the system also happily took me in. I began paying taxes and met a girl, my first true love. It was the first time I considered embracing the system and having a family, and I almost did. Influences in my life interfered. I wished that I had started the family with her, but I didn't. I thought I had some kind of obligation. I was made to believe that I had some kind of obligation. At this point, I was told by my family that I had issues and would need to visit a psychiatrist. And after a short 10-minute discussion with a psychiatrist, I was prescribed Prozac for my 15-year-old brain. I'm confident now that there was nothing wrong with my brain, but rather my environment and the narcissistic culture that I grew up in. In short, the drugs didn't work. I got in a fight and broke some knuckles in my right hand. They had to stick a pin through them to hold them in place while they healed, and I was taken off the experimental drugs. Next, I was dragged into a psychologist. A psychologist doesn't prescribe drugs, they just talk. And actually, it would take me until tonight to realize what he did. He must have realized there was nothing wrong with me, and he has to bring in the whole family. And I realize now that he understood that dysfunction was not from myself, and it was probably pretty risky what he did. And he asked me to talk. I felt so uncomfortable. I realized I had not been allowed a voice. What I said was just scratching the surface, almost nothing at all. And shortly after, my parents split up. There were no talks afterwards, and nobody ever really asked me how I felt. Except these teachers in high school, Mrs. Miller. We would be assigned to go out and look at architecture and critique it, to look at it and really critique what we saw in every way. I don't think she saw what we see in this community, but more so than most. Her eyes were open, and she wanted to help open our eyes too. Her class was the humanities, a subject that I love. Another teacher, Mr. Costello, was a little more extreme and a great example of not just understanding and thinking critically, putting this into action. And here, the complete opposite of what the school was teaching overall, trying to prepare us for more school and eventually a job, career, and a retirement and a death. But Mr. Kostelik, for instance, in one class, told us all of the millionaires of the day, and about 90% of them had no college, were entrepreneurs, and had done what they wanted to do, and not wasted their time. They'd acquired the skills that they needed, and essentially taught us that we don't need to follow this curriculum or way of life. So when high school was finished, I packed my bags and rented a little apartment in Flagstaff, Arizona. It was $300 a month, a little studio, and what I discovered was life was actually really easy. And I don't want to seem ungrateful to my family, employers, doctors, and teachers. I think everybody means well. Everybody thinks they're doing the right thing. At that moment, there's an expression that says the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But unfortunately, good intentions seem to stir up the mud. But the mud needs to be stirred. It's similar to the tarot card, the Tower. The Tower within our own lives. What we research in this community is the Tower as it pertains to past civilizations. But I think eventually it all comes crashing down, and you're left with truth. And I think similar to my teacher who was trying to explain that we don't need to jump through their hoops. You can if you want, it's voluntary. I think it's the same with every aspect of life. We can bring much more peace and prosperity to our lives by rejecting the system. But it's not enough to just reject it. We have to build something in its place, one based on truth. No greater foundation is necessary for a good community. And where we don't know, we don't say we know. We're okay with not knowing. But when we see that something is broken, we acknowledge it. In the last 20 years, I've built 2 small houses. Each one is a little under 400 square feet. I haven't paid for power the entire time, and I miss the old way of life, the little taste that I experienced living in a community, a city, many cities. But when I visit these cities now, after reminiscing about them, I realize there's nothing to miss. They've all gotten worse. Quality of living has gotten worse. But I don't think living alone in the wilderness is something that I want to do for another 20 years. I don't want to hear any more about how broken things are. I'm looking for solutions. I would still want solar and wind power, and I'd want to build a little home, but be in a neighborhood with like-minded people. So I think that's a mouthful for this evening. But anyway, thanks for being here. I love you all. God bless, and I'll see you soon.